Very welcome to this seminar on democracy and media. My name is Bertil Jakobsson and I'm chairman of Novus. And you can say that Novus right now is in the middle of the debate with this seminar. And I'm proud to present this panel for this debate. And from the US, Renee DiResta, Head of Policy for Data for Democracy, a group of tech entrepreneurs who help to educate and prepare members of the US Congress for the hearings with Facebook, Twitter, and Google. Am I right? Yes. And Renee has a strong background fighting misinformation campaigns and computerized propaganda on social networks. So you are most welcome, Renee.
Thank you.
And welcome to Jan Scherman, former CEO at TV4, right? Now freelancing, and recently with a series on public service TV, Long Live Democracy. And John Helin, the question is, will public service be able to fulfill its mission to protect democracy and resist disinformation and maintain trust? John Helin, you are most welcome to this debate.
Thank you.
So the question is now, if in the front of our election in Sweden, will anybody try to manipulate this election? And Torbjörn Sjöström, CEO of Novus, will give us an introduction to the following debate. And once again, most welcome all of you. The floor is yours, Torbjörn.
Thank you. I'll keep sitting here. I've been thinking a lot about human behavior, and as the CEO of Novus, that is something that I always try to go back to, because it's so easy to forget that we actually are humans. And one thing I've been noticing more and more is that we have a world now where we seem to have a more fatalist view in the future, that we are not really in control of our own futures anymore. The technology that will, the future technological advances will not really gain us, but is more of a threat to us as humans. And actually did research on this, and I noticed that the journalists are more scared, or the professions that are the most scared about digitalization as a whole, which also there is a real threat to the journalists today, because robots are already taking a lot of their jobs. But at the same time, we seem to forget that the corporations need a market, and the market needs consumers, and that is something that we tend to forget in the public space. And as a fun to this discussion, this is actually why I put together this seminar, is that there are so many things happening right now where it's hard to actually say it's just this or this or this. We are basically challenging our future and our belief in the future as a whole. But first, we'll listen to Renee DiResta, and she will all focus on what she's done. You get 10 minutes, so it will be fast. But after that, Jan Scherman and Jan Helin will also focus on the challenges they see. But then we have the main thing that is supposed to be a discussion where we actually try to not maybe have the answers, but also try to see where we are heading. But first, Renee.
Thank you all for coming today. It's an honor to be invited to participate. I started looking into what has come to be called the fake news problem about 3.5 years ago now, and it happened a little bit by accident. I had my first son in 2013, and I live in San Francisco, California, and in California we have this system where you have to put your child on a waiting list for preschool, and you have to do it about a year before they're going to actually go in, so you can play the waiting game. And so I had moved from New York to California, and I had heard that California had problems with the anti-vaccine movement. And so I began researching the vaccination rates in the schools and discovered that they were incredibly low. And I found this very bothersome, so I called my congressman, and I said, surely San Francisco can do better than this. And he said, no, we really can't. The anti-vaccine movement is too strong here, and you're never going to get legislation passed. And then about a month later, the Disneyland measles outbreak happened, and about 230 or so people came down with the measles in Southern California, and all of a sudden, the congressmen were very, very willing to act. And so they introduced a law, and myself and 2 other women ran this grassroots organization to try to put a parental face on the law instead of it just being doctors and medical lobbyists working to pass the law. We wanted it to be, authentic grassroots, and so we grew a group of people to talk about the law. And the polling on the law, it was a law to eliminate the voluntary opt-outs, a law to eliminate what were called personal belief exemptions. As this process went on, we began to realize that the social network conversation was almost 99% negative. It was almost entirely anti-vaccine, propaganda being put out on Twitter and on Facebook, but on the polls that we would take of the districts would be 85% positive. So real people in California were favoring this law, and voices on the internet were staunchly opposed. So we started really digging into why that was, and began to get a handle on what came to be called manufactured consensus, or the idea that you could, if you said a message enough times and had enough accounts pushing it out, and relied on things like automation and kind of the constant drumbeat of telling a narrative over and over again, then you would find that the narrative would begin to seem like the dominant one, and that more and more real people would actually sign on and begin to think that this was true. And this is a human bias, it's often called majority illusion, the idea that you begin to think that all of the people around you feel a certain way about an issue, and it normalizes it. So fast forward, we got our law passed, and I did this big analysis for Wired with these big graphs and charts kind of monitoring how the anti-vaccine movement was navigating all of the social platforms simultaneously, most particularly on Twitter. And the State Department actually reached out by way of the U.S. Digital Service, which is a thing that we have in the U.S., whereby technologists can go and participate for a period of time helping the government on a project. And so I was asked, along with 5 other people, to come and help on a project around propaganda on the internet being spread by a different adversary, which at the time was Islamic extremism. And so we began to look very closely at how ISIS was executing much of the same tactics in terms of dominance on social platforms, and using it for propaganda, for outreach, for recruiting, for normalizing their message. And at the time, we were trying to impress upon the tech platforms the severity of the issue and how this was happening in their gardens, so to speak, and how they had to be more proactive at dealing with this. This was in October 2015 or so. Problem was, this is also in the fallout of the post-Snowden era, when we had a leaker from the NSA who suggested that the tech companies were all working for the government, and they were in some capacity, but of course the tech platforms responded to this by really making a concerted effort to distance themselves from engaging with governments. They didn't want to be seen as the puppets of the US government. Also, they were concerned that regulatory environments, that if they took action to police their platforms, then they were in effect exerting some sort of editorial control over a message, and they were very deeply afraid of being seen as media companies as opposed to tech platforms. So we had a bit of an uphill battle with this, and that went on for years, in fact, this battle about what tech was going to do about ISIS. And it really was when Theresa May, after a series of the unfortunate truck situations here in Europe, began to threaten regulation, that we got the first tech self-regulatory step to deal with this, which was called the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. Meanwhile, as the GEC was being established, sorry, not the GEC, the GIFCT, we were beginning to see evidence that Russia had interfered in the US election, and this had been hinted at and thought to be true also in late 2015, for a number of reasons that I won't go into now, our government chose not to intervene more forcefully. The tech platforms, again, were not really partnering with the government, did not necessarily have the best intelligence as to what was happening on their own platforms. But through a series of unfortunate denials in October 2016, took about a year, including a group of us who did know what was going on and did a lot of the research into how the Russian content was spreading, what it looked like, how many Americans engaged with it, began to call for hearings, began to ask that Congress convene hearings to ask the tech platforms to make a full accounting of what happened before Congress for a number of reasons, not least of which that a big part of the American public still believed that the idea that Russia was participating at all was a myth, was propaganda itself. So the net effect of a lot of what we've been seeing, that was sort of the last 3.5 years or so of different actors using the same system in very similar ways, small differences here and there. ISIS really wanted to build a brand and they were very front and center with what they were doing. There was no hiding at all, versus the Russia content that targeted the US was much more designed to look like propaganda made by Americans for Americans. A lot of narratives around secession, a lot of narratives around societally divisive issues in the US, gay marriage, secured borders, a lot of content related to Muslims and refugees and immigration. So they did a good job tapping into, and they actually sent people to the US as the, we have an investigation going on in our government right now, and Robert Mueller actually indicted, I believe it was 13 people involved in the Russia situation in particular, because they actually sent people to the US to engage with real Americans and figure out what their societally divisive issues were, and then exploited those fractures in a rather sophisticated information operation, complete with money laundering and a number of other things. So we have a situation now where we just had yet another hearing. This one Mark Zuckerberg personally showed up to. That's in part because of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which was that there was that Facebook had not done a good enough job keeping user data secure, and that in the olden days there had been a bit of a framework whereby any developer could go and extract massive quantities of data about individuals and all of their friends, so there was no informed consent, no opt-in. So right now in the US, what we're trying to understand better is how to think about what role the government plays versus what role the companies play, how to think about regulation, recognizing that we have certain constitutional protections on things like speech. Speech is not necessarily the ideal framework for thinking about this, but it is one that is incredibly, sacred in the US. And so unfortunately, the notion of what is speech online has become what is authentic speech is really something that we're wrestling with and trying to think about how to manage our platforms in such a way that we get them to think not about the idea of policing truth or policing speech, but thinking about things in terms of notions of information integrity of the voices. Are these real people who are making these comments, or are they trolls? So this is where we're at this interesting place where we're seeing for the first time what a mass system of extraordinarily powerful companies, monopolistic companies even, has exerted, in which no one is in charge. The platforms are paralyzed because they're afraid that if they respond to US government frameworks around takedowns and things like that, then that means that they similarly have to respond to authoritarian and other government requests. And so they would prefer to simply do nothing, but now that that's no longer possible, they're trying to figure out what to do. And then, of course, there is the intersection with human biases and the fact that media literacy worldwide is not particularly high, and so what we see in the U.S. and in Western countries is nothing compared to how this problem manifests in places like Myanmar, where it actually turns to genocide. So I think I have gone on long enough. Perfect timing.
Yeah. John Scherman, what are your worries at the moment?
I would like to start in a totally different angle by saying, if we go to Sweden, remember that things that we normally call lobbying by consultancy is it's absolutely no possibility to scrutinize those kind of activities from some sort of public point of view, because compared with the United States of America, a lobbyist can move into the Swedish parliament without any kind of public registration. And those companies, I think that's my experience from producing those documentaries. They feel that they are in some sort of happy age. They got a lot of contacts and missions from political parties. I showed in a reportage for the Swedish program Agenda a company called the Reform Club or Reform Act, who actually has a register of 4,500 Swedish journalists, and it's legal. And through this register, they of course send out information when some of their customers would like them to do that. This is an enormously strong kind of power that exists in this country since decades, without any possibility again to scrutinize it from some sort of relay on public legislation for those companies. The interesting thing is it is exactly the same thing with the political parties in Sweden. I have many times urged that campaigning or plans for campaigning should be public, but as the political parties are some sort of, association which the law doesn't hit them, they can collaborate with Facebook, with the Reform Club, as they want to do. And it's hidden, it's confidential, and I find it very, very strange that we have a democracy which is built very much on political parties, and the political parties, they are operating actually confidential. It's more or less impossible to put up the papers and show them for the voters, for the ordinary people. So that was two, I think, fundamental remarks. The other thing is that I think we normally tend to discuss, on one hand, media, and on the other hand, the political system. This time it would be great if we talked about both of them. My journey for 2 years, when I've been running around in this country and followed a lot of political people, representatives for the parliament, I must say, referring to your question, what I think about democracy, I'm really deeply negative surprised. I didn't know when I started this journey that we have people in the parliament, more or less half of their spent time is spent on administration. They book their trips, their meetings, their meeting rooms, and the time that is for meeting voters and ordinary people is shrinking like hell. Sorry to say that. So we have 349 in the parliament that more or less is working with other things than driving their ideas about how to change this society. And thanks to Novus, we made a deep study on those people, and I couldn't say that was a surprise, but the figure as it came to us is worth to talk a little bit about, because the conflict between media and the political system, which is normally, I would say, something that is really good, is so strong that it has passed that limit where it is no longer productive, and I would say it's counterproductive and very negative. And both those, the media system and the political system, is more or less playing some sort of game where one part know what the other one needs and vice versa. And this creates a long distance to the voters. Last thing, when it comes to Facebook, which is used on a daily basis by this company I mentioned, the Reform Club, there are so many legal things, legal ways to do it. I got the password for 4 representatives in the parliament and went behind the wall to see what kind of interactions those 4 people had been doing for a couple of years, and all the 4 of them were pretty shocked, and the conclusion was that Facebook seems to know more about me than I knew myself. And in the hands of advertisers and the whole way through the political parties, this is of course more or less, I would call it a nuclear weapon. And if they send out in the advertiser, in the ads, or in the other kind of surveys, oh sorry.
Your time is up, Jan.
No, it isn't. That was the first alarm. Because when we talk about fake news, and I'm not talking about alternative facts, but the truth consists of so many different aspects on a single question. So when you use Facebook as some sort of ad power instrument in a political campaigning, you can really put up the nice pieces of the cake that you would like, and then you send them to those 4,500 journalists or to people who tend to vote on, for instance, the Social Democratic Party or the Swedish Democrats, because that is exactly the facts that you can plug out from Facebook in a legal way. The risk, I'm not arguing against what you're saying, but there is a risk when we talk about fake news. We forget pieces of the truth that you can target in a very sophisticated way against ordinary people, against political parties, and it's totally legal and it's not fake, but it's sorted pieces of the truth. I think I stop there, otherwise the phone will call again.
Yeah, and Helin, what are your worries about the election that we have, and Facebook's and or our view of the world?
Well, I'm most worried, and I think I will use my first minutes to address one thing that Renee mentioned. Are the tech giants literally just tech platforms, or are they media companies? I think this is in the core of the democratic problem. We are now trying to make them responsible as they were media companies, but they say they are not, and in some way my industry, the media industry, has helped them to become both, because we have been naive and not really played it well through the tech platforms. We were too eager to get the reach that the platforms were there to provide, and not asking ourselves the question, what is happening with our relation with the audience? We were literally giving away the relation to the audience to an algorithm that you don't see, don't understand, and definitely not control. And then we complain about Facebook taking decisions about this algorithm, which they never asked, a publishing mission they never asked to be given. But we gave them that by publishing way too much of our content on their platforms, because we were too eager searching the reach. Now, what is the problem about that? I think one problem is, in this naiveness for media, is that we were swept away because we also been obsessed by engagement. We want to engage the audience in a question. Today we know that engagement is a Silicon Valley euphemism for addiction. Engagement is today what drives the business for Facebook. That is why they are so obsessed by engagement. Not because strengthen the democracy or whatever you put into that word. The dangerous logics for an open democratic discussion in relation to these platforms are that they're premiering content that spurs the most strong emotional reaction. That makes it perfect for political campaigning, absolutely perfect for political campaigning, and absolutely a no-go zone for serious fact-based journalism. And I think this is in the core of the problem between media and the tech platforms. And I think maybe we should discuss the solutions later, but I think one of the problems about this is the giant knowledge gap about this being the construction of the tech giants platforms. I think most people don't understand what is the problem. And they see it as just a question of freedom of speech, and there is an important question of freedom of speech, which make me sort of worried when publishers sort of demands from the tech platforms that they do take a publishing responsibility. They say they won't do, they say they are not publishers. They should answer to the law, basically, in a country. Media ethics is something completely different, and it's very important for a media company. But I think that knowledge gap has somewhat been bridged by stories like Cambridge Analytica, and when you do understand, now I see, because I think common people and myself also had a problem understanding what's the problem by giving the fact about I'm now having a barbecue with my friends to an American company. I don't care if they're interested in that, go ahead. What we do understand now since Cambridge Analytica that this is used in a psychographic analysis. So they categorize me as a person into a universal category, which is about 5 different categories. And that is extremely powerful if you want to make political campaigning. And this is not an American phenomena or a British phenomena with Cambridge Analytica. Literally, every small PR firm in Stockholm has that knowledge. They are not that good. It's not on that massive scale, but they are applying the exact same methods. And therefore, I think one of the most, that's my final statement, the most important publishing task now is to answer and make stories about to the public, why is this question now becoming a story? How come this story is now big? Why is this topic trending right now? If we can enlighten the audience with that, that will be probably on a short perspective the most important publishing mission in this election.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking that we have 4 major topics, and we have to start about first Facebook, and then media's role, then the politics role, and in the end the public, and we will try to manage this in 30 minutes, so we'll see how this goes. And we, of course, I think we have to start about Facebook, and one thing that has bothered me from the beginning, and I'm thinking about how I consume or how the public consume information, is that to be able to change your view, you have to have trust in the sender. And looking at how Facebook is being used, I don't see there of being any chance of you actually changing view, but more cementing you or making you even more convinced in what you already believe is true. Because if someone else tells me what I already believe, then actually I gain trust for that person or that sender. But for me to change my views, I really need to trust the sender first, and then I can start listening. And here I'm having problem in how Facebook is actually being discussed, because I seem to hear a lot that you actually tend to change your views to something the opposite, and that actually you can shift an election in a way that I thought the earth was round, but now I see that was not the case. And what do you think about this? Can actually someone use Facebook to shift an election, and in what way would that be, and in what way is that being used? Everybody could answer that, but let's start with Renee. What do you think?
Sure. So I don't think you actually need to change views to shift an election. You definitely don't in the U.S., and that's because we have 330 million people or so, and you just have to reach the ones who are going to turn out. And so American politics has always been about, we have traditionally not very high turnout, and so if you can reach the people who are likely to turn out, and get them to go out and vote, and simultaneously suppress your opponent. So voter suppression was a big piece of what we saw, or believed to have happened in 2016. So it's not the precision targeting is really the game, and that's what makes Facebook effective. So you can get in there, and there's a series of different types of audiences, including one called custom audiences, where you can simply upload a list of email addresses, and Facebook's job is to find those people on Facebook. So if I have a voter roll, or if I have someone who's subscribed to my candidate mailing list, I can then in turn upload that as an audience to Facebook. And then I can also create what's called a lookalike audience, where I say not only those people, but people who are similar to them. And similar to them means because of either a demographic profile or a psychographic profile. That's sort of Facebook's black box. But what it's effectively allowed me to do is reach the people who are most likely to go and turn the election in my favor, not by changing their mind, not even by engaging with them on any kind of substantive policy discussion, but simply by doing really good targeting to make my opponent's supporters feel bad about, in this case, her, or to galvanize them and amp them up about my candidate. And so that's how it works.
Yeah.
I think you must remember that we're talking about a tool that is really, really sophisticated, and you can do your cherry pick in so many ways that if you want to target people to convince them from right to left, no, that's not the case. But if people you target people that, for instance, is pending a little bit when it comes to, let's say, environment questions or efficiency in the industry, and you see a possibility to move them from not from one corner to another, but a little bit to the left, then you can do the cherry pick, and you can be very sophisticated in your information. Again, I'm not talking about fake news if you take it to the other corner. And of course, this has some sort of impact. If I, in my Facebook stream, find a lot of messages, let's say about sausage, as I'm a sausage lover, and there will be a party that would really promote this stuff, my first reaction would be, oh, very nice, and I will go further on. And this is something that the first reaction is exactly, you can laugh. But if it gets more and more sophisticated, I recommend everyone nowadays to go to click a little bit further into the Facebook service, find settings, click settings, and go to ads. And you will find in a very easy way all the 500 or 1,000 interactions you have done yourself. And it's very well organized. Journeys, interests, food, whatever it is. And for a customer, of course, this is a dreamland. For a political party, it is a dreamland, because you can target your message more or less like surgery. That's what we're handling. And to your question, well, from some sort of my personal point of view, because this refers to everyone who is a user of Facebook. And I think 70-75% of the Swedish population is in Facebook. I think quite many would be a little bit embarrassed about this huge knowledge that someone over there has about you, me, and you, and some else probably. Torbjörn also. Maybe. So it's not a question about moving someone from that corner to another, but people pending can be very severely targeted through this tool.
And John Lin, what do you think?
Well, I think to the issue on trust, of course, it's important with trust. The question is not that. The question is how you gain it. And it used to be like this. If you were a media company and you sought the truth, fact-based and piece by piece, you gain trust. That was a good world order. Now we live in times very clearly where it's possible to gain a lot of trust without telling the truth. Media used to work against that because you were asked and you were challenged on your facts. Facebook doesn't do that. So you can spread a lot of political stories or fake news or whatnot and gain trust because you will not be asked for it, and you will reach the right people in the right way who will reflect your opinions. And that's not new knowledge. We know that people are more more lean towards to agree with something that you already thinks. So if it reflects your opinion, you're more likely to accept what is said. And I think for media companies, it's extremely important to understand that if we come to a situation where you have to choose between trust or truth, you have to go with the truth. You have to go after the truth. If that is sinking your trust, live with it. And count on that the trust will come later and you will deserve it. And if not, well, that's another world order, and we will not raise the white flag for that now. We will go after the truth. So I think for a media company to be obsessed by trust is dangerous.
Mm. Yeah, and then let's talk about the media, because if I look on the U.S. election, and in the beginning when Trump was one of 12 candidates, I think, nobody expected him to actually be a threat. But at the same time, he was in media every day because he was an engagement magnet, and this shifted him. This moved him from being one of 12 to actually be the main candidate from the Republican Party, and that was not because of Facebook. That was not because of the social media. This was actually the traditional media who gave him this platform. Because from what I still see, and I see it in Sweden, I see it in the US as well, we more or less trust the media, and we trust Fox News, but we know they're biased. But we also know where they are, and apparently people believe more in Fox News than CNN because they feel that CNN is not open with where they stand, and we expect everybody to stand somewhere. But what I've been thinking about here is also the how what is news? Dog bites man is not news, but here in the US we have a man that bites a dog 24 hours a day, and it's still news. And this probably was a big problem. How do we handle this guy? Because the presidential candidate is actually newsworthy information. But what I can see is that actually the traditional media set the stage. They actually made it that we had two candidates. Without traditional media, Trump would not be the last man standing on the Republican side. And then we have Facebook, and at the same time we talk about we're not trusting news because they are fake news, etc., and everybody is biased. And I think what you said, John, about trust as well. I think trust is not being. If you are being criticized a lot, it means that somebody cares. It means that you expect someone to do better. It's good to be criticized. So criticism is not something that says that you don't trust that person or that media channel. On the contrary, but from my point of view now, the only way we can understand the world we live in is through the traditional media. Then we can see Facebook and the algorithms that are making things bigger or smaller, but the world as we know it is known through the lens of traditional media. And this has always been my core and thinking about how do we form a public opinion? How do we think that vaccination doesn't work? Then we can get cemented in the views from Facebook bubbles or what we want to call it, but the ideas has to come somewhere outside of Facebook. So yeah, now I've been talking too long about media's role, but what do you think about this?
So there's two things I would say. The first is the way that things make the leap from social platforms to mainstream media is, I think, underestimated or not discussed enough, and that's that if something is trending on Twitter, there are many, many journalists who will write about it credulously, or uncritically. They will not really dig too deep into whether it's a manipulated narrative that shouldn't have been there in the first place, or who might be behind that narrative. So instead we get a sense where journalists got, in my opinion, a bit lazy and began to simply write about trends on Twitter as if these were real things that merited serious concern. This is the sort of problem where we see consistently manipulated hashtags and things that were made to trend through coordinated, manufactured consent, but we saw a lot of things that kind of cross the chasm from Twitter into mainstream media. Even if the media is writing something debunking it, they're still giving it oxygen. And so a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily be stories become stories because some group of people gets them trending on Twitter. So Twitter is actually the bigger, problem, so to speak, with regard to the intersection between social platforms and media than Facebook is. And the other thing I'll add is that we're really good at measuring content in a couple different ways. Like, we can measure the production of content, so we can tell you, anybody with an analytics platform, any marketer, any newsroom, any researcher can tell you about the production of content, how many articles are out there about a particular topic, or how many people are talking about it on Facebook. We can measure the consumption of content. So once it's been produced, we can tell you how many engagements it's getting, and this is, per my co-panelists, both the notion of what people are choosing to engage with, the measures, the metrics of engagement are what not only the platforms are concerned about, but also candidly what the media companies are concerned about. What am I writing? We see this with A/B testing of headlines, for example. I write for Wired sometimes. I know that if my article goes out with a mediocre headline, it's not going to get nearly as many clicks as if it goes out with something that sounds sensational, candidly. And I wrestle with that because I would prefer it to just be like a statement of what it is, but I also want those views, right? I want that message to get out there. And so the production and the consumption are quantifiable. What's much less quantifiable is the absorption, and that's the third piece of the puzzle. And that's something that really only the tech platforms right now have a very solid understanding of. And that's where we look at, can you shift people? So the absorption piece is, does my content change hearts and minds? Does my content influence people? Does my content make someone do a thing, take an action, change their opinion, like a page, you name it? That's the piece that we don't have as good of an understanding of right now, and that's where I feel that this narrative around media culpability versus social platform culpability for a lot of the problems is that we don't really understand whether it's the mechanism by which it's shared, or the platform where it appears, or simply reading the words themselves. If someone just went to the media property themselves and read it, or saw it on Fox News, where the truly influential paths of delivery are.
This is both strange and a little bit complicated, because it's so easy to forget that Trump is not the only president who has been lying. I mean, it has happened before. I don't mention the names or the stories, but everyone knows. And it's also easy to forget that Obama used internet in a very, very efficient way, and we liked it. And I can take a very small, concrete example on a good use, as I think it's a very good and efficient use of Facebook and social media. Up in the north, in a little city called Jokkmokk, people started a Facebook group because they didn't trust media, they didn't trust the local politicians, and the big company Vattenfall planned to close down all its activities here up in the city and move the jobs to a bigger city called Luleå. 4,000 people signed in for 2 days. The Social Democratic Party up in the north has 200 members. They got 4,000 sign in immediately, and they forced Vattenfall to change the decision. Is this good? Or is it bad? Is it democracy, or is it some other kind of system? We tend to like it. But of course, when social media, Facebook, Twitter, or whatever it is used like Donald Trump, and everyone gets totally obsessed by reporting about it, That's one problem. The other problem is that meanwhile this is going on, and it goes on not only in Fox News, it goes on in CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, in Swedish media. Donald Trump, I think he makes a lot of decisions that doesn't get the same kind of publicity in the media. This is actually what I think is one of the most problematic things. We can't neglect what's going on in Twitter. That's totally impossible. I mean, but if that is the power that obsesses us so much in media that we forget to report on other things that probably could be more relevant, then we are stuck in a very, very big problem. And then we come back to the mistrust, I would say, because people discover what we are reporting about and what's going on in social media.
Well, I think on one hand, it used to be also like this. Okay, it's not the first president who is lying or the first people in power who is lying, but it used to be like this. If you were a journalist and you disposed that lie, you won a prize, and everyone
That's
thought
true.
you did something good for democracy. Now you're being blamed for trying to narrow free speech, and I'm exaggerating a bit, but what can be good to remember is that it has never been an uncomplicated business to dispose lies from government. If we take Watergate, the most celebrated disclosure of all times in journalistic history, just a few weeks before President Nixon resigned, the Washington Post was in deep, deep trouble. Almost all American media were after them and say, what were your sources? How do you know this? Are you right? And Ben Bradley, the editor-in-chief for Washington Post, was on CBS 60 Minutes and was asked by Mike Wallace how he looked upon all this. And he had a columnist writing that the blame for Washington Post is going to be hard because they were breaching bank secrecy and whatnot to find the story. And he said, what do you do? And he said, if you're a publisher, you hunker down. You hunker down and you realize that we're not here to be loved. We are here to seek the truth. And 3 weeks later, Nixon resigned and Ben Bradley was a journalistic icon and a hero. But it wasn't that easy. So I think for a journalist today to be blamed for this and that is you have to live with that. And the trust doesn't come immediately. It comes from seeking the truth and go about it and go about your business. And as I was saying, and to Renee's point, that reporters today tend to be, this trends on Twitter, so hence it's a story. I think it's really important to describe, rather ask yourself, why is this trending? What influencers are involved here? Are there bots involved here? That's the true story about a trend today, not just reported that this is trending.
And I'll stay a little bit more about the media, because I think you all remember the email hacks, and that was released via WikiLeaks, and I think it is a fact now that this was part of a Russian or the hacks were from Russia, and if we look at what people remember about Clinton, it was everyone remembers email, and on Trump's case it was so many scandals. It's like nobody remembers anything in specific. But I think here was, and Obama also commented on that in December when he left, that the focus on the email hacks, breaking news, new emails, but nobody actually had read them. I see several problems there, because back to Watergate, okay, this may very well be real news, but at the same time we're not sure if every email actually is true. It would be very effective to just put in a couple of really incriminating emails there. Everything else is true. How on earth are we going to handle that? I think it was attempts at about the same thing in France, but this was so late in the election that media actually they don't write about the election the last days. And this, I think, will be the biggest challenge that we have in the elections. And I think will ask John Lean first. What do you think?
No, but
Or
there's a-
Scherman? Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, what we forget a little bit, I think the pressure on media is more or less incredible high, because we can take a terror attack, for instance, that comes out normally on Twitter or Facebook or wherever it is. And when it comes to the thing you say, Jan, about checking up, ask questions, is this true? Is this relevant? Where does it come from? The high speed tempo puts such a pressure on traditional, well-educated, well-established media organizations, that the risk for mistakes gets higher and higher. And I think we will see this during compared to the US, the small Swedish election. You will see it every time you have breaking news, that there is a high speed power going on the social media, and you have the well-established, well-educated journalist trying to scrutinize what is actually going on. And there has been so many discussions about this. I don't see any solution. I just want to point out this is one of the biggest problems that we face for the moment. Can we say no, stop, because we don't know this for sure? Or shall we publish it immediately as soon as we get it on some sort of trend on social media? That's a totally brand new situation.
Yeah. What if somebody sent Swedish television a bunch of, here is social democratic hacked emails?
Feel free if you have them.
Yeah, but what if they weren't true? How on earth could you? Because
if
this
you
is
have
what
faked them, everyone.
Yeah,
so
of course. Or
of
faked
course.
no, if we have faked 1% of them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, no, that's kind of hypothetical, but
Yeah, of
but
course it
but I
is,
mean,
yeah.
a journalist's job is to verify information
Yeah.
and to be critical against the sources. So it's good old journalistic methods that
Yeah.
will answer that question, and you need to have faith in them still.
Yeah.
Despite of all new technology, it's still the most relevant journalistic question is is this trustful information? Can we verify it? In whose interests did it come to us, and so on? You know the drill, but it's very important to do the drill.
Yeah. So no breaking news, new emails.
No, that's a good question
because I think that's just
yes.
that headline incriminated.
Yeah.
No matter what the
it's
content
hard
was.
to take out the fast factor in journalism. You want to be first.
Yeah.
And that's usually a good drive, but it can also be a destructive drive, absolutely. There is no value in information that later proved to be false.
Yeah.
And that sounds like an obvious thing to state, but it's in reality that could be a real tricky one.
But this is not theory. I mean,
I know. Yeah, it is.
I mean,
it's
we have experienced when it
Yeah.
comes to terror attacks. We have experienced it when it comes to stories linked to Me Too, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, you're right.
And when a couple of months afterwards, we can discover what was actually the truth. I think we come back to media, well-established media, and the trust vis-a-vis the audience that gets hurt every time those kinds of mistakes become public. And who will be the winner?
But I
Well,
think
probably people like Donald Trump, who's always accusing media for fake news, and then we're trapped in the stories ourselves. That is more or less fake news.
Yeah, yeah, but because I think this is the real threat to the democracy as well, because we are in such a hurry to be first that we actually forget to show the big picture.
But that's a classical problem, and I think the new problem is that media today is part of a political rhetoric, and we're not used to answering to that political rhetoric. We're not used to that, and I think the only answer can be fact-based journalism, to go on about your business and do more of good journalism.
Yeah.
But to that hypothetical question, is I still trust journalists to do the job, to find out where did this come from, is it relevant and is it true, and in whose interests did it get here?
I agree totally, but the only thing I'm saying is that I think that the problem is much bigger because we are living in media in an international world in a way that we didn't do before, because we could take care of the Swedish territory.
But I still
The second thing is the high speed tempo that is also brand new, and that creates, I would say, a lot of huge challenges for journalism.
It is, but I think one new method as a thumb rule, is that even an English word, thumb rule?
We
Tumregel.
understand, yeah. Rule of thumb.
Now I understand.
No, but as okay, basic rule then. I think there is a problem in the editorial process in some parts, that you are too quick to ask yourself, when there is a statement from a political party or whatnot, you ask yourself who thinks the opposite and who can be here by 9 o'clock tonight. The first question should be, is this true? Is this relevant? Can we prove it? And what can we say about this story? And then start asking, okay, how do we make this an engaging discussion tonight? But I think there are several examples of that where you jump too early and sort of skip the most fundamental basic journalistic questions. I think a lot of newsrooms.
And sorry
have
to
to
say
realize
this,
that
this doesn't have an impact on you, but in the commercial part of media, which is pretty big, there is a click ratio that also have a great impact on the speed of the decision, and that is also important for the political people. That if you do this, if you say this, and you twist it a little, and maybe you even do half lie, half true, it will click like hell, and a lot of click means a lot of money.
Yeah, and that leads us into the politics, how they actually adapt to the digital age or the new media scene we have now, and the social media. And I think you started answering that as well, because the truth is not that click-worthy. And it's not that, if something is complicated, that's not what sells in the media. So you actually have to make it more binary and or black and white. And also a half lie is a very good start of a debate in national television. So yeah, we have a couple of minutes, and we will be late here. But what do you think about how the politics has adjusted to this new climate or the new world we have now?
Well, I think that, I mean, I can really only speak to that in the US. The official parties, like the Democratic Party in particular, has been a bit slow to fully grasp the new media ecosystem. I think you saw that. One of the things that came out was the way that the Trump campaign ran something like 57 million, I think it was, ads, and the Clinton campaign ran several orders of magnitude less. I don't recall off the top of my head if it was tens of thousands or if they cracked 100,000, but the number of messages that they sent was much less targeted. They weren't doing A/B testing of messages quite as rapidly. It's interesting because the Obama administration, the Obama campaign, was in fact one of the first to begin to think about this kind of targeting. But then the sort of new ways of sophistication and the automation piece, they kind of lost that battle, so to speak. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about, though, both related to the politics and then also the integrity piece, is the thing that we haven't really talked about very much, which is the video and audio, manipulated video and audio that's becoming increasingly prevalent, very easy to do. And so in the US, we have the House of Representative elections coming up in November of this year. It's 435 seats up for grabs. It's considered to be a critical election in terms of if the House flips, there's a lot of things that are much more likely to come to pass if the Democratic Party retakes the House in the U.S. It's also considered like it's an extremely high stakes series of campaigns that are going to be coming out, and so there's a sense that not enough has changed since 2016 on the behalf of the tech platforms, meaning that while they have each made some individual strides, the systemic manipulation problem remains unsolved and no one is in charge. And then as the audio and video manipulation gets more and more sophisticated, we are reliant on journalists to begin to authenticate things like tapes and videos. And the challenge that we have in the US is there's the notion of impugning the trust of the authenticator. So even the fact-checking efforts that we have in the U.S., that Snopes and some of the others that have traditionally fact-checked textual things or things that are really easy to prove or disprove, there's been coordinated attempts to erode the authority and the integrity of the folks who are actually doing the authentication itself. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in. This is where we do kind of go back to the question of who bears responsibility. We actually are saying that, in terms of just the least cost avoider problem, the platform is in fact potentially better suited to do at least a first couple passes over this integrity, video integrity, image integrity piece. And then we're largely reliant on journalists for the rest.
Yeah. And in the core of that is to verify information, which is becoming increasingly harder. And
Right.
and the methods now to fake a video or fake which you tend to trust, because seeing is believing still. Well, I'm worried about that, and I'm concerned about it. I don't have any good answer. Then we need to develop our methods to debunk that kind of information also.
The political parties are really skilled, because I would say during the latest 10 years they have recruited a lot of press secretaries. They have the knowledge. They really analyze how media works. They develop good networking with journalists, which means that for the audience it gets more and more complicated to understand where does this news derives from. And here again, there's a lot of challenges now that we put on media and professional and well-established media organization, but that's the truth. Suddenly I remember, actually it's not new, because it's just more high-speed tempo, more sophisticated. I really would like to recommend that old book, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. He starts with Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Those were the days. They talked for hours, and during the presidential campaign, there were no Twitter at that time. And then they went home, took dinner, and finalized in the late evening. And Neil Postman moves up to, the TV stories with the sound bites, etc., etc. And we are now in the post period of Neil Postman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the politics are very good at playing the media game. If it's a social media or if it's a traditional media, they are really good at playing that. But what I see now, and if we go to the last part, the public is the public. I know we'll be 10 minutes late at least. The public is not really in on this game. They didn't really understand. The voters didn't understand that the games and the rules changed. I think that there is where we have the part of the problem, because. If you look at the leader now in the media, they're basically there because they messed up somehow. It's not because they're good at anything. If you're not in Russia, then the leader is always great, and China. But looking at the Western world, you're actually screwed up if you are in media, and you're also not very. The focus is on the fight. Its focus is on the two sides, and the other side is always the worst thing that ever could happen to everyone. And so the question then is, who do we actually trust? If we don't trust the leaders, and if we don't trust the media, because the media is only polarizing the leaders, what do we vote on? Do we vote on something that's good or something that's not bad? And I think here is the actual shift that we see right now, because we don't know who to trust, and everybody looks more or less stupid in the media, because everything is so flat, narrow and small and thin and fast, so you never understand the bigger picture. And who will actually give the bigger picture now? Because it is a vacuum for information, and the information now is being filled by fake news, because the public are actually actively seeking answers to all the questions they see about the politicians, about the society, and about the news media. So this is actually my take on this. Somebody has to actually start drawing the bigger picture. What is actually happening? Because we can't, sorry to say, not trust on the news coverage to actually give you the bigger picture anymore. Yes, Jan, you have to answer this.
Yes, I'm not completely buying into that
Yes,
dystopia.
I know.
We're working pretty hard to do what we can, not to convince what you should vote for, but to provide you with a fact-based information so you can make your decision on what to vote for. We're also working quite methodically now with constructive journalism, trying to make stories about how a problem can be solved. And of course we have, as we always had, the politicians coming into our programs to debate because they're there to debate, not because they have screwed up. And we're actually doing a new format as well, where the politicians addressing the nation in an immediate format, where there will be no questions, just okay, here's 15 minutes, explain to us what is your vision. And so we're doing some of that, and I see some good things happening in our newsroom, and excuse me for talking for my own product, but we are focusing on constructive journalism as an important part, because I do think there is one true bias in media, and that is negativism, and that has been the story on journalism since its beginning. But it's true that there is a bias in negativism, and we're trying to work on that.
Yeah, but I think that's the only way forward. And looking from an international perspective, Sweden is pretty blessed of. I see from a media perspective, US as the bad example that we never want to go to. I'm sorry, but actually, that's not the kind of media that are.
But the interesting
Well, they do both the best journalism and the worst, so that's always the case with.
Yeah. I don't want the worst. Jan Scherman.
Yeah, I would actually like to prolong what Jan is saying here, because I think in one way you could say that the opportunities to really do a good job with the coverage of political ideas, things that are not talking about figures and mathematics when it comes to taxation or whatever it is actually better than ever before. The problem is, if I go to the election 2014, a study made by Media Vision, sorry to mention, they came to the conclusion that 6 out of 10 first-time voters picked their information from not public service, but from Facebook. So how to make this relevant so that you really attract the audience? It's not easy.
No, it's not easy, but we still have a good shot at it, and also the data supports that. When public service do have a problem with younger audiences with news, except for one period of time, and that is election years, young people do tune into public service to get information.
And do you want to add something, Renee?
I think that the piece with social networks is as we talk about trust erosion in the U.S. is very, very low trust in media per I believe it's risen a little bit recently, but traditionally it's not been so great in the last few years. That does mean that people really do prioritize the information that they get from trusted sources like friends and family, which is one area where social platforms are basically delivering you news from your friends and family. So it reinforces biases, but it also, people have just kind of a sense, like they believe that people are sharing things that are good. And so a lot of the focus in the US is on media literacy is the term for it, encouraging people to really check the narrative and check the sources before sharing, so that things don't go viral and spread quite so quickly. Even Facebook knows that, if you share an article without actually having read it, like you read the headline and then you share, it actually considers that a negative signal. It considers that an indication that it's clickbait or outrage content. Also the little emoji faces that you can react with now, the react-G, they are also a signal that the content is potentially angering or creates sort of a bad emotion. And so they're looking at how that kind of cascades through the platform. As they think about, somebody mentioned it before, I think maybe, no algorithm is neutral, and so it's the bias of the engineers and the cultural biases of where the algorithms are created. And so we're trying to think through, since the platform is effectively curating what you see, can it curate it in a more ethical way?
Yeah, and I think we have to close with that. And only one thing, I think the biggest challenge now is that everyone who's responsible in any part actually has to work on their trust.
Yeah.
Because if you can't work on your own trust, you're not relevant anymore. But thank you very much for coming here, and I'm very glad you came.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.